Can I first of all just thank the organisers for the invitation to speak today, and also congratulate all the organisers and the participating artists in what is an amazing and a fantastic collaborative project, I think, which sets a benchmark for projects of this kind. What I want to do today is to link the idea of citizenship and the role of policy by the state to ideas of validation of art practice and production, validation of distribution and experience, and validation of participation. Also to question our inherited models of provision, and then to propose some other ways of thinking about these issues into the future. Because we need to question the existing systems of validation, and to question what and who is inside and what and who is defined as outside, and to understand the relevance of these designations to ideas of full citizenship. For me, it's really time now to do what is necessary for change in terms of validation, policy and practice, including institutional practice, be it cultural or educational, in order to transform an inherited vertical hierarchy of value into a horizontal relational field. To do this effectively, we have to have an analysis and an understanding of where we are right now, 100 years after the proclamation. And this is also relevant to other transnational contexts, if we accept, as I am going to argue, that the process that we're, I believe, coming to an end of was actually put in place 100 years before 1916, in the early 19th century. This was a period when many of the dominant norms about the nature and purpose of art, nature and purpose of artists, and of art institutions were developed and put in place, and were then woven into a developing socio-economic fabric and an agenda designed to serve a set of political, economic, social and cultural vested interests. And I think it's very important to be clear about that process and the resulting models of value to which we are still working, if we are to understand what these are and what interests they serve, if we're going to be clear about what it is that we have to do to transform these conditions in this period. Because what we're going through at the moment in Ireland and elsewhere is not a period of recession, but a period of resetting of our economic, social and cultural expectations. And for me, culture includes the arts, education and health and well-being. What is underway is a resetting of a set of principles considered as fundamental to a decent society. These principles were agreed and put in place in Western Europe in particular immediately after the Second World War, and were known as and referred to as the post-war consensus. And these principles were that poverty should be attacked by the state rather than just managed, that full employment was a legitimate goal of government, that healthcare should be free at the point of use, and that social mobility should be facilitated by access to education, especially third-level education. It's also interesting that in the same period in the UK, the idea of arts being provided for at arm's length from government was also created and was proposed by an economist, John Maynard Keynes, who has come back into discussion recently because his economic policies were anti-austerity in terms of getting out of recession. He was also the first chair of the Arts Council of Great Britain and developed the idea of arts councils. So since then, of course, and particularly over the last 20 to 30 years, there has been a widespread retreat from these sorts of principles. And as a result of concerted attacks on these principles since the 1980s, and the promotion of deregulation and privatisation of public domain and public services, we now have a broken economy. The real danger in abandoning these principles, which are actually underpinning principles of citizenship, is that we will now also have a broken society. And by broken society, I mean a society without empathy. A society in which the aspirations of the proclamation about citizenship and also the post-war consensus are not simply unrealised, but are actually impeded and negated. So the stakes are very high in this period, I would argue, because once the resetting settles, it'll stay set for a very long time. So the shape of our society, I think, depends on our sector stepping up and fulfilling its responsibilities in relation to this issue of how our society is going to be reset. So paradoxically, there is also opportunity and a responsibility to turn passivity and acceptance of the status quo into participation and a new ordering of experience and value. And this will only work if we begin to repurpose the purpose of art. As I have said, the dominant models of production and distribution and validation that we work through now were essentially formed in the 19th century. This was a reflection of an imperial worldview, a self-image held by Western European nation states and of Western European culture as automatically superior to other cultures and otherness. The early to mid-19th century, not only were European nation states consolidated as we know them, but so too was that collective worldview which separated identities and defined them as inside or outside, politically, economically, socially, and culturally. This was rolled out across the globe, but also enacted internally back home on the basis of economic class and social stratification. The early 19th century was also the period when a particular definition of art and artists and of their value was developed, and was the beginning of a critical discourse and an agenda which culminated in a dominant 20th century modernist mindset, which was not successfully challenged until the late 20th century, mostly by the feminist movement in the West and by movements for political independence in other parts of the world. But these challenges were based on the development of new discourses and practice centred on the validation of the other, however defined. During that period in the early 19th century, the industrial capitalism, as we have known it up to the present, in which, of course, the value of the worker was alienated from the value of their work. European nation states were consolidated in Western Europe. And at the same time, artists began the idea of the artist as disconnected, as poetic, as eccentric. You know, the poet, the artist in the garret idea was a construct which separated and disconnected art and artists, I think, in terms of a discourse and a validation process from society. Singular ideas of the idea of the singular tortured genius in some way as the dominant model, which is actually a disempowering model for artists. Also, we had the development of the institutional models that we know very well now in terms of museums as repositories and sort of treasure houses, which ultimately by the mid-20th century had separated art's aesthetic responsibilities from its ethical responsibilities, and also separated the figure of the artist from the ground of society, from the social. And by social, I mean shared meaning and values. And it is from this point that we see the hierarchy of inside and outside emerge and solidify in art and the arts in general, but also in economic and political terms. The point is that we have to create and add a new discourse to this field if we expect the outputs to be different and the outcomes to be different in the future. We will not be able to transform anything if we do not understand how that mindset is so deeply embedded in our culture, in the popular mind, in the popular media, and in our systems of governance in relation to culture and cultural participation. The current models of value and validation, which despite substantive challenge by many practitioners, still dominate the social and cultural landscape. To achieve any sort of transformation will involve a bridging process rather than a bonding process. This is not about us in the arts sector bonding with each other. This is about bridging to other sectors and as it were, transferring a discourse of value and about validation and value from our sector specifically to the political sector and to policymakers. It seems to me that's a huge and urgent need, I think, in this period. So it's about them, and them being those who are not already part of the cultural conversation, rather than about us who are already in the sector and part of the conversation. This is one of the reasons why it is so easy to marginalise the arguments made about funding the arts when they're presented to policymakers, because it seems as if we're talking about us rather than about the well-being of society and the wholeness of society, rather than the idea of a fragmented society. So the idea of the artist and the art process as singular and separated rather than an inherently social and transactional process has actually, as I've said, has actually disempowered the artist, as well as the so-called non-artist, because it has defined and positioned art's value in terms of what it is and its exchange value, rather than what it does, its use value. And this is reflected in the nature of our institutions as well, I would argue. In my view, the use value of art is to create empathy. And that has always been the role of value and value of art in the longer term human project. And empathy as the use value of art can be created anywhere. It does not have to take place only in metropolitan centres. It can happen anywhere that relationship is built between people. But I need to stress that the conditions I'm describing here, the dominant conditions that I'm describing here, are actually man-made. They are not absolute. They are presented often as absolute and unchangeable. But because they are man-made, they can be changed. We have an opportunity, as I said, and a responsibility to work for that change in this period of resetting, to reset the dials on the dashboard, as it were, not just by lobbying, but in practice, which is what this whole project does so well. Wherever you happen to be in practice, to articulate and embody that process of change. Of course, this change momentum has been underway for some time and is already accelerating, and crucially, there is now a critical discourse in place which is necessary to support individual and groups or organisational practice in this space. A paradigm shift, however, is now a necessity because a sort of social and economic retrenchment seems to be widespread, and that 19th century worldview hasn't gone away. The marginalisation of other seems to be permissible again and is at the forefront of political discourse at the moment transnationally. And it makes this period of resetting, I think, quite dangerous in a way, because some of the gains that we might be talking about here and in other contexts that we feel we've made are in danger of being rolled back, not simply on the basis of resourcing and the lack of financial resources, but in terms of the values and the nature of the society that we want to live in. And we can see that being played out very dramatically in terms of migrants and immigration and so forth. But these are fundamental issues about values, and we need to be stepping up. I'm going to just take a step back a moment and just talk about these images. I'm going to show just two images. This is a map of the world as understood, the known world as understood in the early 16th century, which in Western European terms was the age of discovery, as if the rest of the world didn't exist until we discovered it. What's interesting here is this idea of the known world and the unknown world. And in some of these maps, and particularly in this one, which is where it first appeared, copying Roman maps, where areas that were unmapped and unknown were written up as "here be dragons," or in the Roman terms it was "here be lions." But what I'm talking about is this idea of a known world and an unknown world, a mapped world and a non-mapped world. And this is the idea of inside and outside. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is how deep-seated these concepts of inside and outside are. We might be trying to explore what they mean in the space that we're talking about here in terms of creative arts, but these are very deep-seated concepts which form the society in which we live, in which these value systems are played out and result in either marginalisation or being inside or being defined as as outside. Which is the button here? To get the next slide, sorry. This is actually the cover of a catalogue and a poster which was used in one of the early exhibitions in the Museum of Modern Art, designed by the first director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Alfred Barr. And MoMA is a hugely important institutional model that has been replicated across the planet, and has formed critical debates about the role of art and its position in society and so forth. And this was a very important exhibition in which the argument was made for the inevitability of the kind of art that was being produced in the mid-20th century in New York being the ultimate arrival point for art practice, for visual art practice, i.e. Abstract painting, non-geometrical abstract art or geometrical abstract art, and everything else defined as a rehearsal for the real thing. Negro art, Oriental art, all the categories of art that went before. And it only goes back a certain timeline. This is another mind map that we're dealing with, even in this period. Even though many arguments have been made against that linear thinking, it is still an extremely powerful mindset. So there's two mind maps here, one from the 16th century, Renaissance, rediscovery of classical values, elevation of the human being over nature, and the human being capable of exploiting nature, all of those issues that have begun to destroy the planet, in fact, going right back to the idea of mapping and values associated even within the classical period of Roman culture, right into the 20th century. This is a mindset. It's not just simply a period in historical time. This is a consistent mindset which is all about defining the inside as special, privileged, powerful, and having access to resources, and outside being a negative space, being here be dragons, in a sense, or here be lions. So the question I'm posing is, who draws the maps? Who says what is inside and what is outside? And who comes up with those definitions and validates those definitions? Historically, it's been the white Western European male cartographers, if you like, who've actually drawn those maps and continue to draw those maps. And as a result, the female, the ethnically or socially or psychologically difference in general, in fact, including the local and its folk culture, have all been defined not only as other, but as less, as beyond, as outside. Whereas the truth of the other is to do with the primacy of purpose, the why that art is made, over the form, the what of art. Purpose takes whatever form it has to in order to articulate and communicate, in order, I would say, to create empathy. And that is a relational process. Of course, we now know that otherness was not and cannot be erased because it is not marginal. It is central to our humanity. It may change its form, but can negotiate rather than try to replace the canon and build a relationship with the canon, working in relation to the canon that we've inherited and all its apparatus of power. The concept of citizenship as participatory is necessary to engage in those sorts of negotiations, because citizenship only works in a relational field where the rights and the responsibilities of the individual are worked out in relation to other and with other human beings, to other citizens. Citizenship, in this case, is a form of participation and not simply a form of certification. And I would argue that culture is now the only space in which those negotiations can be enacted and empathy created. If empathy is seeing self in other, then it's clear that neither globalized economics nor the inherited models of party politics can create or deliver empathy, as they are no longer designed to do so. Culture must take up its responsibilities in this space, but understood as a civil culture. And the word civil means belonging to citizens. So what does a culture that belongs to all citizens looks like. What are the support mechanisms that need to be funded and resourced to provide for a civil culture? And how different would that be from our existing systems? So what's necessary now, I would say, is not just a new economy. And we're hearing lots of talk, and we've endless talk over the last several years about the development of a new economy, a knowledge economy, a learning economy, a huge sort of buzz phrases coming out all the time. I would argue that what's necessary now is a new ecology, which validates the interdependence, not the separation, of social, economic, and cultural capital. We need to do this because as I said before, when the resetting settles, it's going to stay set for quite a long time. And if it, in our opinion, sets in the wrong way, it will retain that shape for a very long time. So my argument is for a move away from a rhetorical model of practice and value in person or in institutions. And a rhetorical means not expecting an answer, to a reciprocal model of practice and value, to connect signature value with participatory value, whether articulated in traditional or non-traditional forms. This is all about purpose and rather than form. And anyway, it's clear that new forms of art will emerge as they have to in relation to that, and are already emerging from this sort of dynamic. This means, I would argue again, thinking in 4 dimensions. And by that I mean, just as a reference point, we have a one-dimensional model of art and the artist in particular. And that's the idea of the 19th century idea of the genius separated from society, locked in the studio, not apparently unconcerned with the real world. The two-dimensional model, in this model that I'm articulating, acknowledges the value of getting out of the studio, so engages with the gallery system, but it's a very narrow and heavily mediated space in which to try to communicate. The three-dimensional model is a process that's developed over the last 20 or 30 years, which is the emergence of public art as a process for art making, but often does not represent a change of ideology, simply a change of location. What I'm arguing for is a sort of 4-dimensional model, which includes all of the above, all of the other models, and more. The idea of the artist as a negotiator, the idea of shared agency, but also an acknowledgement of the situation, be it a personal situation, which is the prompter for making art in the first place, or an actual given situation and context in which one can work. So my argument, I hope, is not about a denial of either the inherited processes or the existing models, but it's about, not a denial of the inherited canon, but an expansion and validation of relations beyond the canon. Expanded practice, building on an expanded idea of the academy in education, leading to an inclusive evolution of the canon. So in taking on this sort of challenge, we have to consider what are the implications for what is already in place. When it's not simply a matter of replacing a one-dimensional model with another one-dimensional model of art or artist, because there would be no actual change in that way. And what I've been trying to emphasize is the degree of work that has to be done almost at the roots of the tree in order to change what it is the blossoms end up at the top of the tree. And for example, if my argument that the purpose of art in whatever form is to create empathy, and the process is relational and reciprocal, then could we think of merging those institutions which are concerned with empathy? Could a hospital be a museum? Could a museum be a college? Could a college be a museum? It's a question of merged purposes. It might also mean merged physical forms, but doesn't have to, in those institutional settings, which are charged with and depend on the creation of empathy, understood as the ultimate value in a society. This would mean a new practice-based and institutional ecology, which would be very resistant to policy marginalisation, because the costs of creating empathy now in the present are far less than the costs of repairing a broken society in the future. Integration with social situations is key. And by social situations, as I've said, I mean situations of exchange, collaboration, sharing, communication, and participation. In a phrase, seeing self in other as a definition of citizenship. Thank you very much.